Hi, guys. I'm Tela Mathias, one of the managing partners at Phoenix Team, here with my good friend Brian Woodring.
Hey.
And we are doing a 10-part series on accessible AI, especially on how it's going to change the face of software development. The first time we talked about problems broadly and how software development takes too long, costs too much money. And with mass availability of this new generative technology, we think we can change that. And then when we left you on our last segment, which was part two, we were talking about how we can use generative AI to really get to the good ideas. Because if the process isn't the problem, getting to those good ideas as fast as possible really is.
Mm-hmm.
The theme of this segment, part three, is finding and keeping shared understanding, otherwise known as I didn't know that's what you meant, which we hear a lot. We hear it in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And of course, it's worse when you hear it at the end. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, so for anybody who's worked with me on a software delivery project, one of my favorite sayings is that it really doesn't begin until the day you have a shared vision of what success looks like on the team. Up until then, you're really just trying things and experimenting, but you really don't reach the point where you know you can deliver a product until the entire team, from product managers to engineers, all really deeply understand the why and the what of what you're trying to deliver.
And why do you think finding and keeping shared understanding is so hard?
Well, I think the biggest part of it, right, is that everyone's going to interpret the same facts or ideas a little bit differently. So there's a natural amount of variation. Then two, the ways to combat that are often viewed as really time consuming, and they're often the first thing that gets dropped. And realistically, a lot of that comes down to documentation. Right? What scales really well in a software team is writing it down. I'm a huge believer. Write your ideas down, write the requirements down. But typically that's the first thing that goes in a crunch, and it's pretty much always a crunch.
I agree. And I think that especially post-pandemic, now more than ever, I'm not sure Agile ever really recovered from the lack of co-location. I think one of the key tenets of Agile was people work together, they can have that shared understanding. It's easy to find it, it's easy to keep it. We're all looking at a bunch of stickies on a board. And I think what we've seen post-pandemic is that co-location hasn't really ever recovered. And I think what we're also seeing is that travel is expensive. Talent is everywhere. This is a tough talent market, and talent is all over the country. And let's face it, people do have families, and that we have only just a few precious days on this earth to spend. So is there a better way than just co-location?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about throughout your career, all of the projects or products that you've worked on that were really run by what amounts to oral history, right? Someone new joins the team. How do they learn why we do things this way? How do you get the build to run? What milestones are we trying to go after? They learn it by just talking to people. And a lot of that are the conversations that happen between the meetings, right? They were just the water cooler chat or people just talking to each other casually. With less of that, I think that really only emphasizes the need to write those things down. Once again, that's often very time consuming work.
I agree. And I think what we've seen also, especially when it comes to writing it down, the way that I write things down is not necessarily the way that you best absorb information. When we have the wide array of skill sets and backgrounds, very common on a high performing Agile team, how I work, how I understand, how I learn, and what I need is wildly different. So I may be doing the best possible job I can, and then I give it to you, and then you put it out in production, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not the right thing. And you say, hey, I didn't know that's what you meant.
Well, so not only do different people maybe need or benefit from different communication styles or different types of artifacts, but certain types of information just work better. Some things are better in a diagram, some things are better in a storyboard, a visual, a prototype. Some things are better with written narratives, some things are better with a formula. To really comprehensively and clearly document a product, it takes a lot. It's not just writing a one-pager. You're not going to write a
Right.
future press release and you're done. You have to do extensive work to really flesh out the entire product, which going back to is like that's such a challenging thing to do when there's a constant drumbeat of we have to ship faster. And so much of what Agile's taught us over the last couple decades is we value working systems more than documentation, which is true, but it doesn't mean we don't value documentation.
That's right. I agree with that. And I think one of the other things we tend to see is in this kind of product people versus engineering people. Now we're all technology people,
Mhm.
right? But I think we see different ways of engaging,
We do.
and we have different energy, and we have different ways. So let's say we were able to be co-located, and we had a psychologically safe environment. That still doesn't mean that the best idea, who's going to come from potentially the quietest person, is going to necessarily be resident in that co-located environment. And I think what we've been talking about is, what would it look like if there was a better way? If the process isn't the problem, if Agile never really bounced back from the pandemic and may never bounce back from a co-location perspective, what does the future look like? What's an alternative?
Yeah, I mean, you start thinking about things like, well, what if you could have an entire collection of artifacts and documentation that were always current? That's the other challenge, right?
Yeah.
We talk about challenges around really creating excellent documentation, but one of them is that the day you write it, it's outdated. The software becomes desynced from any sort of written artifact almost immediately the next time someone does a push. So keeping all of that current is something I've never really seen a team do. That's the reality of it. In 25 plus years of doing product development, I've never seen any team that thought they did documentation well. Even when they did it relatively better than any other team I've seen, I've never worked with a team that said, "Yeah, you know what? We've got great documentation. You can come on our team and get onboarded, spend a few hours reading, and you're good to go." Nobody thinks they've got that, even when they have pretty good documentation, because they know it doesn't really match and it's never really accurate.
Now, if I channel my inner Brian Woodring, does documentation get software to production faster?
It does not. It
Mm,
does not. Well, no and yes. No, in that clearly almost no customer you're ever going to have is paying you for documentation.
this is a good point.
But yes, in the sense that without, I wouldn't say documentation gets you there faster, but shared understanding and shared
Shared
vision
understanding.
absolutely does.
I agree. And I think what we're seeing when it comes to a lot of the raw work, and we talked about this in, I think, segment one. And if everybody makes software pretty much the same way, some of us do it better, some of us do it worse. I see in the raw process of creating software, I see a lot of busy work today. And it isn't that that work isn't important. It is important. It's a barrier really to getting to the good stuff. And my hypothesis is that there is a world where there is much less busy work, where the getting to the base user stories, for example, can be done in seconds, and then we take that initial cut and we go through it. What if there was an environment where I got what I needed, the way I communicate and the way I understand, uh, like that the first time? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, look, I think all you've got to do is look at the backlog of any significant software product. And if we're being honest, it's pretty dire, right? Half formed user stories, things that people meant to get to and never did, no acceptance criteria, no test cases, no clear specification. And it's not, I think, because people don't care. And it's not because people are incompetent. I think people want to do the right thing and mostly they're capable of doing the right thing. It's because if it's that or shipping valuable software, 9 times out of 10, you're going to ship valuable software. You're going to scramble whatever you've got to do. The difficulty then is you accumulate the sort of lack of vision death after a while, where yes, we shipped something, but the expectations of the person building it and the customer don't align. So while we did ship the feature and it works, it doesn't actually solve the business problem the way the end user is expecting it or needs it to be solved.
And I think what I'd like to see in the future, especially with this new combustion engine that we have, right? The internet, the personal computer, now we have generative AI. What I'd like to see is a world where the less glamorous, less really unique parts of the work are all done for us. I got what I need the first time. I can get myself rapidly up to speed in a particular domain. Everything is just there for me. And I'm not talking about tools, right? I think we all know this, that as much as the tool can be useful, let's face it, we all have graveyards of good ideas that are buried in our application lifecycle management tools. Let's talk about tools. And is Gen AI just another tool?
Well, so here's what's really, yes, but here's what's really interesting about this. I think you and I were chatting about it earlier today. So much money and time and energy is spent building tools for software development teams. But the vast majority of that is for the software engineers.
That's a good point.
It's DevOps, it's CI/CD, it's IDEs and coding copilots, lavishing attention and energy on engineers. I'm a career engineer. I don't hate that. However, if you look at the equivalent amount of effort being put into building tools for product owners, product managers, designers, it's tiny. It's a diagramming tool here, a mock-up tool there, and a ticket tracking system that mostly creates work. It doesn't actually solve any of it. And so, yeah, you've got a lot of people who, to your point, they're spending a lot of time doing what amounts to paperwork, which, while it's important, it's certainly really important to write like a
It is.
high quality user
That's
story.
right.
It's probably not the defining characteristic of a great product manager is their ability to write great user stories. And that's probably something that a tool can help make much faster and more consistent so that hopefully they're focusing on how you're going to grow a business, how you're going to achieve product market fit, the things you're really actually hiring those folks to do.
And I think there is a better way. I do think that a lot of the raw work that is helpful when you're talking about a new domain and a new team, but that takes a really long time to get to that point. And the journey that you go on, your process, my process, for example, is I really do kind of get all up in the weeds, all up in the details. I write things down. That's how I learn. I explore, I expand. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to phone a friend. That's how I learn. How would you say that you learn? And we can contrast.
I
these
typically learn
styles.
by trying things and failing, right? So my learning style is build something, show it to somebody, see whether it succeeds, whether it fails, right? So there's different styles of doing that. And to your point, whatever each of us produce in a typical environment where software is being made is going to be stored on different SharePoints or Basecamps or Jira or wherever,
Right.
like all over the place. There's usually not one shared idea. You've got ideas like, well, the product documents are here, but the architecture diagrams are there. But like that's the same piece of technology, right?
That's right. It's
Like
a different
it's the
format.
same
Yeah.
lens. It's the same thing you're looking at from different lenses, I guess is a better way to put it. And the fact that there isn't in a typical team one source of truth. This is what we are trying to accomplish. This is what we're going to build to accomplish it. And then maybe a lot of that paperwork can be created by that.
That's right.
I think that's where we think this is going to go.
I agree with you. And I think before we wrap up our segment, what if any member of any team producing product can jump in right in the middle and it's like they were there the whole time? Maybe I'm already very mature in my thinking and I need only the lightest weight of user stories. And what I really need is a storyboard and an evolved prototype to make my ideas come alive. And I think with generative AI and AI, especially if we can pull these things together in the different parts of the software development lifecycle, I think that we can make it like we were there the whole time. So maybe the team has been really curating ideas and in this imagine space, they've been finding the good ones and rapidly testing through storyboards and prototypes with our customer. And then we have an elite level software engineer who joins the team. Well, let's get that person up to speed on all this curated materials and visualizations and things that are there as if I'd been there the whole time, which is not a substitute for collaboration and conversation. But if I can get what I need in the format that I need, produced by generative AI, curated by value engineers in a human on the loop format, I just feel like maybe there's something there.
And then what happens if that engineer, when they start to make changes, maybe an architecture will change? Instead of now suddenly everything else that's been produced is
That's right.
immediately wrong, everything else that's been produced is immediately regenerated in accordance with the new architecture. That's the kind of dream state that I think has never been achievable with the tools we've had until now.
I agree. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. So this is our Accessible AI series. I'm Tela Mathias. This is Brian Woodring. We've been talking about how AI and generative AI will transform the way software is made. We've covered the challenges. We've covered ideation. We've covered shared understanding. On our next segment, we're going to be talking at a lot more detail about requirements and what requirements look like in the future and how we can cut the waste out of the requirements process and really get to value a lot faster. So thanks so much for being here, Brian.
It's going to be great.